ordained Christian minister. However, she doesn't practice in a church. Her ministry is to people whose bodies are broken and who are dying. She is a hospice chaplain. And the story I'm about to read in pieces, is too long to read in its entirety, is about her encounter with a man who scared her and scared everyone else, and what she learned from meeting him. He was a big man, both tall and broad. The left half of his body filled the chair. The right half seemed to be melting away. The skin on the right side of his face drooped inches down his cheek from a long, flapping jowl. Lips more downturned than seemed possible, and his eyelid draped across the socket. The left side of his face was set like stone. Eye squinted, lip a firm, smoldering line. Anger radiated out of one side, exhaustion from the other. He'd recently been discharged from the hospital to this nursing home, a lovely, private, and expensive place. He was dying of something else, but the stroke was what people noticed. It left him aphasic, or no longer able to speak, and no longer able to use the right side of his body. His left side, though much less damaged, was stiff and spastic. I talked to the nurse to try and get a sense of who he was, since he wouldn't be able to speak to me. She didn't know him because he'd come to the nursing home for rehab after the stroke, after he lost his ability to talk. She said they don't know much about how much brain damage there was. He didn't smile, make eye contact, or interact with the staff except to fight them when they tried to touch him. He was prone to rages in which he would lash out with his left arm and leg. She suspected that brain damage might be extensive. "I wouldn't go in there," she said. "He doesn't like visitors, and I don't know what he would do." "Okay, I'll just call his wife to give her my contact information in case she ever needs anything from me." She calls the wife, who pleads with her to go and see her husband. She knows that he's difficult, and she knows that the staff, as is understandable, is paying as little time with him as they can. But she knows him before the stroke, and she tells Carrie Egan about the kind of man he was, a good husband and father, a man who loved his faith. She said, "Please go and see him. Just read a little bit of scripture to him." So she goes back, gets warned again by the nurse, and goes in very afraid. And again, the man cannot speak. So she tells him that she spoke with his wife and that she found out he likes the Bible. Would he like her to read some scripture for him? In which he lunges his good arm out as if to grab the Bible. Now this Bible, she goes on to say, was kind of small and frail. Those thin pages we know of that are hard to turn. But he is insistent, so she hands the Bible over to him and puts it in his lap. And for 10 minutes, he slaps it back and forth. Pages are flying out of it as he's trying desperately to find something. And she sits there, not only afraid of what he's doing, but watching her Bible be torn apart. But he is determined to find this one passage of Scripture. And when he finally does, he hands it back to her. And that's when her heart sinks, because it's from the book of Jeremiah. Now, if you don't know much about Jeremiah, that's okay. It's a long book, and it's difficult to read because most of it is Jeremiah pronouncing condemnation from God upon the people of Israel, telling them how awful they have been and how God has rejected them. And she thinks, oh, of all the books he wants me to read from Jeremiah, but he is insistent and points to her to read this. Do you want me to read this to you? I asked. For the first time, he looked at me. I thought I saw the barest nod. I looked down at the torn and mangled Bible now in my lap. I quickly scanned the 2 lines at the top of the page. I looked over at the man. Is this your favorite? I asked stupidly. He looked away so that his drooping side faced me. And I read these lines out loud. I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with an unfailing kindness. Tears began to roll down his cheek, but he was quiet. I was relieved. The verse he'd landed on wasn't a blistering attack, it was calm. I had the remainder of my Bible back. And then, because I was afraid, and because my fear stopped me from being curious, I stopped reading. Okay, I said with false brightness, time for me to go. And I picked up my bag and walked out. Later, she reflects on that meeting, her own behavior as well, and writes this. His wife had not asked me to comfort him. She had asked me to see him. In that, I failed. I visited him, but I had not actually seen him. I hadn't been able to see past his stroke-damaged body. The desire to be seen and known and accepted for who one really is comes up time and again with my family's impatience. It must be hard when other people's perception of your body does not match up with who you know yourself to be. And when people judge you based only on that body, it must be hard when those around you refuse to accept you as you identify yourself, finding you frightening or something to pity. Now hear the story from the Gospel of Mark. Then they came to the opposite shore of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as he got out of the boat, a man coming from among the tombs, who was under the power of an unclean spirit, met Jesus. He made his home among the tombs, and by this time nobody could restrain him, not even with a chain. In the past, he had often been restrained with fetters and chains, but the chains had been wrenched apart by him, and the fetters shattered. And no one had the strength to subdue him. Now throughout the night and day, he stayed among the tombs and in the mountains, screaming and mangling himself with stones. But when he saw Jesus from far off, he ran to him and groveled at his feet, screamed at the top of his voice and said, "What's your business with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I call on you in God's name, don't torture me." Jesus, you see, had said to him, "Unclean spirit, leave this man." Now Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" And he said to him, "My name's Legion." That's how many of us there are in here. And he pleaded with Jesus fervently not to dispatch the demons out of the region. In that place on the slope of a hill was a large herd of pigs, grazing. So the demons pleaded with Jesus, saying, "Send us into the pigs, let us go into them." He gave them his permission, and the unclean spirits went out of the man and into the pigs. And the herd, there were around 2,000 animals, barreled down the crag into the sea, and in the sea they drowned. Then their herders ran away and brought the news to the city and the countryside. And people went to see what had happened. And they came upon Jesus and saw the man who had been possessed by demons. But now he was sitting with clothes on and was clear-headed, though he had had a legion of demons in him. And the people were frightened. Time after time, Jesus crosses a line that most of the people around him, even his own disciples, were too afraid to get near, let alone cross over. And in story after story, we see someone healed, restored, and saved. Well, let's start here. As you in this congregation wonder about your future, as you're thinking and dreaming, discussing, perhaps even worried, these are important questions to ask. And so let's start with some basic ones. To be a good church, what does that mean? I think at times to be a good church means you have to do odd things. A true church, what is a true church? I think sometimes to be a true church, you have to do uncomfortable things. We are different from other organizations that have rules and regulations of who's in and who's out. But here, when the doors open on Sunday or any other time, anyone can come in. And we say, all are welcome. We say, all are children of God. Well, some stories. If you've heard me before, you know I've got a lot of them. I've become one of those old retired ministers who's got a story for everything. Many years ago, I served a church in a town much like Hancock, where we worshiped in an old but beautiful building, much like you do. This was in Lenox, Massachusetts. And in the town, there was a private school for young women who were very severely mentally ill or mentally damaged. It was called Valley Head. And for a time, a small van or bus would pull up on Sunday morning, and one of the counselors would bring in 6 or 7 or 8 of these young women. And they would come into church, and we'd all smile and step away a little bit, because their behavior was difficult, especially in the good order we like on Sunday morning. They would always sit up front, in the front pew. I don't know exactly why, but that meant that I was the closest to them compared to anyone else. One Sunday, one of the young women, for some reason, who knows why, started to become very agitated, and then very verbal in that agitation. And it was really almost impossible for me to continue the worship, or for anybody in the pews to focus on what we were doing, because we were so attracted and distracted by this poor young woman. And what I remember hearing is the counselor, trying to tamp it down, said this to her: Amy, excuse me, Amy, you've got to be quiet, this is church. But she just got more agitated. Look, you've got to stop doing this. And she got more agitated. And then she said finally, stop hallucinating. And I thought that was a pretty good metaphor for what all of us were doing there in church. Because in a sense, we're pulling out things from the air, a faith in God, a faith in Jesus we've never met, but we believe in with our whole hearts. And it calmed her down. And I thought this, in my mind, was the moment when they really, truly were part of us. All are welcome. And to the credit of that congregation, when the bus one Sunday didn't pull up with the girls from Valley Head, many of them said, where are our girls from Valley Head? Moving on to another church I served, which was after this church in Lenox, This church was a suburban church, fairly large, successful, content, a lot of upwardly mobile people. The men wore suits and ties, and the women wore makeup. This was the early 90s, and people were feeling pretty good about themselves and their prospects. But they were also aware that in this suburban town, there were unspoken, but certainly enforced, rules of behavior, and especially around personal behavior. Not all, of course, but I learned that a lot of suburban churches are very tender and afraid because they're afraid of not fitting in quite the way the town expects them to. Or in this particular case, as I like to say, they were one paycheck or a lost job away from getting kicked out of town because the mortgages were very high. Well, there was a moment in my years there when someone from the congregation stepped up and did something I thought was remarkable and crossed over that line of suburban politeness, that middle-class attitude, and did something that was truly Christian and truly made this place a church. I didn't cause it. I didn't call for it. It was somebody in the pews who did this. She asked for a time for during announcements. And she got up and she mentioned the name of a young woman, mid-20s. They all knew because this young woman had grown up in the church, come through Sunday school and the youth group, but hadn't got to college and had become pregnant. The father disappeared. And that's a tough place to be in if you're in a suburban congregation or community. However, the young woman's family did take care of her. The delivery came successfully, and there she was, alone with this child, with some friends and family to help her learn how to be a mother, although she was very young. Well, the woman who got up, who talked about this woman, said, "You all know her. Well, her family's moved away, and she's pregnant again, and the father is not willing to participate in this. So we need to step up and take care of her because she is one of our own." And so, through that time of her pregnancy, many people in the church called her, took her to doctor's appointments, cared for her and her child, and made that a successful pregnancy, and made her feel loved, and not shamed, but wanted and accepted and loved. And they had a baby shower for her, and what I can tell you is that after the delivery, and after she was well enough to come to church, she was in the pew with her 2 children every Sunday. Jesus crossed a line with this man that nobody wanted to be near. And because he went over, and yes, he's Jesus, that man was restored. He was saved. When we say, all are welcome, let's really mean it. Not so much for ourselves, because it's going to make us uncomfortable. It's going to make our behavior seem a little odd. But let's do it for the people who come through these doors, because no one else wants them. They're judged everywhere else. So the question I put before you in this time of transition, in this time of wondering and dreaming, do you want to be a good church? Well, then don't be afraid to behave a little oddly. Do you want to be a true church? Don't be afraid, then, to be a little uncomfortable. Remember Carrie Egan's honest telling of her emotions about going into the room, and she was afraid. But what she got out of that was as much as what the man got out of it. And I would say, in the language of the church, salvation came to both of them that day. So, when you put a sign out front, or welcome strangers, and try to turn them into friends, when you say, all are welcome, for Christ's sake, you better mean it.